The fluorescent lights of the rusty spoon buzzed overhead with a low, constant hum that matched the headache beginning to form behind Elena's eyes. It was a Tuesday night, which meant the restaurant was packed with the after-work crowd, people in suits and ties. Loosening their collars and looking for a place to unwind, Elena moved through the tight maze of tables like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged by the customers unless they needed a refill or a napkin. Her feet throbbed inside, her non-slip sneakers. She had been on the move since the kitchen opened at 4 in the afternoon, and now at 8 o'clock, the adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving nothing but bone-deep exhaustion. She balanced a heavy tray loaded with burgers and fries in one hand, deftly weaving around a busboy who was moving a little too slow. "Coming through hot plates," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else, because no one was listening. She dropped the food off at table 12. The man sitting there didn't even look up from his phone. He just grunted, which in the language of waitressing meant, "You can go away now." Elena forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is there anything else I can get you folks? Another Coke, maybe? Some ketchup?" The man shook his head dismissively. Elena turned and walked away, wiping her hands on her dark apron. It was stained with grease and a splash of marinara sauce from earlier, a badge of honor in a way, but mostly just a mess she couldn't wait to wash off. Life hadn't always been this frantic. There was a time, not so long ago, when evenings were for creation, not service. Elena caught a glimpse of her reflection in the darkened window as she passed by. The tired woman, staring back, looked older than her 25 years. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail to keep it out of the food, and her makeup was wearing thin around the edges. It was strange how a dream could dissolve so quietly, replaced by the loud, demanding reality of rent checks and utility bills. She made her way to the kitchen pass-through. "Order up," the chef yelled, slamming a bell. Elena grabbed the plates. She thought about the piano sitting in the corner of her small apartment. It was an old electric keyboard she had bought secondhand, the keys slightly yellowed with age. She hadn't touched it in 3 weeks. Every time she walked past it after a shift like this, her hands were too tired, and her spirit was too drained. The music that used to live inside her felt like a distant memory, locked away in a box she didn't have the energy to open. At table 15, a family was causing a commotion. A little boy was crying because his ice cream had melted, and the parents were arguing about whose fault it was. Elena approached the table with her best customer service voice ready. "I am so sorry about that," she said smoothly. "Let me get him a fresh bowl on the house." The father stopped arguing for a second to glare at her. "It's the principal," he snapped. "We paid for good service." Lena nodded sympathetically, though inside she felt a wave of irritation. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a peacekeeper, a therapist, and a cleaning crew all rolled into one. As she walked back to the kitchen to get the replacement ice cream, her eyes drifted across the room to the far corner of the restaurant. There, sitting in the shadows, was the old upright piano. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, dark wood with intricate carvings on the legs, but it was mostly for show. The Rusty Spoon wasn't the kind of place that hired live musicians. Most nights it just served as a shelf for extra napkins and table tents advertising local businesses. But sometimes, late at night when the crowd had thinned out, Elena would run her fingers over the keys if no one was watching. She never played a full song, just a chord here and there, testing the sound. It was usually terribly out of tune, the lower notes sounding like they had a cold. But touching the keys gave her a tiny spark of connection to the person she used to be. The girl who had spent 10 hours a day practicing scales. The girl who had played at recitals and actually made people feel something. That girl felt like a stranger now. Nowadays, her hands were used to carrying heavy trays and scrubbing tables, not dancing across ivory keys. Her fingers were rough from the constant washing and the harsh soap the kitchen used. She felt a pang of sadness in her chest, a sharp little ache that she had to swallow down. The customers at table 8 were waving at her, looking impatient. She pushed the feeling away and hurried over. "Can we get the check?" the woman asked, tapping her fingers on the table. She looked bored and ready to leave. "Of course," Elena said, pulling out her pad. "I'll be right back." She rushed to the computer terminal, punched in the numbers, and printed the receipt. It was all automatic. Her body knew the routine, even when her mind was miles away. She brought the check back. The woman handed her a credit card. While Alina processed the payment, she overheard the woman talking to her date. "I saw that girl looking at the piano," she whispered, not quite quietly enough. "I bet she doesn't even know how to play it. Probably just wishes she could." The date laughed. "Yeah, looks like she's got her hands full enough with the water refills." Alina kept her head down, sliding the card back to the woman. "Have a good night," she said, her voice steady. She didn't correct them. She didn't tell them that she had been playing since she was 5 years old. She didn't tell them that she could play Rachmaninoff from memory, or that she knew the jazz standards better than the band at the fancy hotel downtown. What was the point? She was just the help here. In this uniform, with her sore feet and her tired eyes, her past didn't matter. Only the service mattered. The shift dragged on. The rush finally died down around 9:30, leaving the restaurant half full with lingerers who didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. Alina cleared a table by the window, stacking the dirty plates high. She looked out at the street. Cars were passing by, their headlights cutting through the darkness. She wondered where everyone was going. She wondered if any of them were going home to play music, to paint, to write, or if they were all just tired like her. She leaned against the counter for a moment, taking a rare second to breathe. The manager, a stressed-out guy named Dave, walked by. "Alina, you can go start your side work if you want," he said, not stopping. "We're slowing down." Side work meant restocking the silverware, polishing the glasses, and wiping down the condiment bottles. It was the boring part of the job, the part that required no interaction, just mindless movement. Alina grabbed a bin of clean forks and knives and went to the wait station. As she sorted the silverware, her mind wandered back to the piano in the corner. It was so close, just 30 feet away. It was dusty. She could see a thin layer of grime on the lid. Nobody respected it. It was just another piece of furniture to them. But to her, it was a sleeping giant. It represented a voice she hadn't used in a long time. She remembered the last time she had really played. It was at a small community center before she moved to the city for work. She had played a piece by Debussy, and the way the notes had floated in the air, the way the room had gone completely silent, it had felt like magic. She had felt powerful. She didn't feel powerful now. She felt invisible. Alina finished the silverware and moved on to the glasses. The clinking sound they made in the bin was jarring, a sharp contrast to the music in her head. She sighed, wiping a strand of hair out of her face. She just had to get through another hour. Then she could go home, take a hot shower, and maybe, if she wasn't too tired, she would play a few notes on her keyboard. Just to remind herself that she still knew how, but deep down, she knew she probably wouldn't. She would probably just sit on the couch and watch TV until her eyes closed, waking up the next morning to do it all over again. It was a cycle, a routine that was slowly grinding her down. She looked at the piano again, almost wishing someone would just go over there and play it, just to break the monotony of the night, even if it wasn't her. Little did she know, the monotony was about to be shattered. The door to the restaurant opened, letting in a cool gust of wind and a small group of loud men in suits. They looked like they had already started their party elsewhere. They walked in with the kind of confidence that comes from having too much money and too little sense. They sat at the large round table in the center, the one that always gave the servers trouble. Alina watched them settle in, straightening her posture and preparing herself for the final push of the night. She didn't know it then, but these men, specifically the loud one in the gray suit, were about to change the course of her entire evening. And maybe, just maybe, the course of her life. She grabbed her order pad and took a deep breath, putting on her game face. Time to serve. The group of men in suits demanded attention the moment they walked through the door. They were loud, laughing too loudly at jokes that probably weren't that funny. And they smelled of expensive cologne and old whiskey. Alina watched them from the safety of the wait station, steeling herself for the interaction. She knew the type. They usually tipped well if you stroked their egos. But getting there was exhausting work. She grabbed a handful of menus and walked over to the large round table they had claimed. As she approached, The conversation died down for a split second. It was that quick scan customers did, sizing up the server to see how fast they could get what they wanted. Alina kept her smile professional and plastered on. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady. "Welcome to the Rusty Spoon. Can I start you off with some drinks? Or perhaps an appetizer?" The man sitting in the center chair, the one in the gray suit, who seemed to be the leader of the pack, looked up at her. He had a ruddy face and a tie that was loosened halfway down his chest. He looked around the restaurant, his eyes darting over the decor before landing back on Alina. "Just beers for now," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "And whatever's on tap that isn't water." The other men chuckled. Alina nodded, ignoring the comment, took down their orders for a round of IPAs and lagers. She retreated to the bar to place the order. The bartender, a quiet guy named Ben who had seen it all, gave her a sympathetic look as he started pulling the taps. "The rowdy bunch?" he asked. "The usual," Alina replied, leaning against the back of the bar. She rubbed the back of her neck, trying to work out a knot that had been forming all day. "They just want to be loud and be heard. I can handle it." By the time she brought the tray of beers over, the men had settled into a rhythm of bragging about work and complaining about their wives. Alina distributed the glasses with practiced efficiency, setting coasters down to protect the tables. As she set the last beer down in front of the man in the gray suit, he didn't say thank you. Instead, he turned his head and looked toward the dark corner of the room. "Hey," he said, pointing a finger in the direction of the old upright piano. "What is that thing doing there?" Alina followed his gaze. The piano sat there silently, gathering dust in the shadows. "That's just for decoration, mostly," she answered. "Sometimes people sit there if they're waiting for a table, but no one really plays it." The man scoffed. He took a long swig of his beer and wiped the foam from his upper lip. "Decorations," he muttered, shaking his head. "What a waste. You put a piano in a place like this, you should use it." He looked around at his friends, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I bet I could make that thing sound better than it looks." One of his friends laughed. Since when do you play, Richard?" "I took lessons when I was a kid," Richard insisted, though his slurred words suggested he might be exaggerating his proficiency. "My mom made me go for 5 years. It's like riding a bike. You don't forget." Alina tried to step away. She had other tables to check on, and a lecture on childhood piano lessons was the last thing she wanted to listen to. But before she could escape, Richard stood up. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of the table, and then marched toward the piano. The restaurant quieted down a little as the patrons watched him go. It wasn't every night that a customer decided to provide the entertainment. Richard sat down on the bench, which creaked under his weight. He cracked his knuckles dramatically, rolling his neck as if he was preparing for a Carnegie Hall performance instead of a Tuesday night at a diner. "Watch this," Richard announced to his friends. Into the room at large, he placed his hands on the keys and hit them hard. The sound that came out was jaranga, discordant crash that made people at the nearby tables wince. It wasn't a song. It was just noise. He began to bang out a rhythm that was uneven and aggressive, his fingers mashing the white keys without any regard for melody. He was trying to play a classical piece, maybe Beethoven or Mozart, but it was unrecognizable. It sounded like a toddler having a tantrum. Alina froze near the kitchen. She watched his hands, the way his wrists were stiff, the way he was striking the keys rather than caressing them. It was physically painful for her to watch and hear. She knew that piano, she knew how the action felt, how the keys stuck slightly if you didn't press them firmly enough. He was fighting the instrument, and the instrument was losing. Richard laughed at his own noise, looking back at his table with a grin. "See, culture," he shouted. His friends clapped politely, mostly to humor him, but the rest of the room was not amused. A couple near the window gathered their coats, looking annoyed. The mood of the restaurant, which had been tired but peaceful, was now tense. Alina felt a flush of irritation rising in her chest. It wasn't just that he was bad. It was the arrogance. He was treating the piano like a toy, something to be smashed for a cheap laugh. He had no respect for the music or the people around him who were just trying to eat their dinner. He was drowning out the conversations and the clinking of silverware with his ego. He stopped abruptly, letting the last jarring chord fade into the air. He turned around on the bench, spreading his arms wide. "Encore?" he asked the room jokingly. There was a smattering of nervous laughter, but mostly silence. Richard frowned, realizing he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He needed a bigger reaction. He needed to prove that he was the life of the party. His eyes scanned the room, looking for a target. Someone to bring into his little game. They landed on Alina. She was standing by the wait station, refilling water glasses. She felt his gaze before she even saw him point. "Hey, waitress," Richard called out. His voice cut through the low hum of the room. Alina looked up. "You're looking at me like I'm terrible," Richard said accusingly. "Do you think you can do better?" The restaurant went quiet. People stopped eating. The kitchen staff slowed down, poking their heads out of the pass-through to see what was happening. Alina felt a sudden spotlight hit her, invisible but burning hot. "I didn't say anything, sir," Alina said politely. "I'm just working." "Oh, come on," Richard taunted. He gestured to the piano. "You walk by this thing 50 times a night. You probably stare at it wishing you could play. I bet you can't even play chopsticks, can you?" His friends laughed on cue. It was a classic bully move, picking on the staff to impress his buddies. Alina felt her hands ball into fists at her sides. She wanted to tell him to sit down and shut up. She wanted to tell him that she knew more about music than he would ever understand. But she couldn't. That wasn't her job. Her job was to take the abuse, smile, and move on. "I don't play," she lied. Her voice was quiet, but she hoped it was firm enough to end the conversation. "I don't believe you," Richard said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He slapped it onto the top of the piano. $20 says you can't sit down and play one song. Right now. Just one. He looked at the other tables. "What do you say, folks? You want to hear some music or just listen to me bang on the keys?" A few people chuckled nervously, but no one wanted to be the one to tell him to stop. Alina looked at the money on the piano. It looked dirty sitting there on the dusty wood. She looked at the manager, Dave, who was standing behind the counter with a worried expression. He gave her a slight shake of his head, signaling her to just let it go. To ignore the drunk guy. But something snapped inside Alina. Maybe it was the long shift. Maybe it was the months of ignoring her talent, of hiding who she really was. Maybe it was just the sheer disrespect of this man treating a beautiful instrument like a joke. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of being the person who cleared the plates while other people had the fun. She took a deep breath. The air in the room felt heavy. "Fine," Alina said. The word surprised her as much as it surprised the room. She walked out from behind the wait station. She moved slowly, her sneakers squeaking softly on the floor. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant was fixed on her. She walked past Richard's table, past the couple who were whispering to each other. Past the kitchen door, she reached the piano. Richard stood up, smugness radiating off him. He stepped aside, offering the bench with a flourish. "Be my guest," he said. "Don't be nervous." Lena didn't look at him. She didn't look at the $20. She sat down on the bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. She reached up and undid the tie of her apron, pulling it over her head and dropping it onto the floor beside her. She wanted to feel free. She placed her hands on the keys. They were cold. The smell of old wood and dust filled her nose. It felt familiar, like meeting an old friend you haven't seen in years. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Alina closed her eyes. She blocked out Richard. She blocked out the tables. She blocked out the tiredness in her bones. She was just a girl, and this was a piano. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, pressing against the walls like a physical weight. Alina sat on the hard wooden bench, her back straight but her shoulders relaxed. In front of her, the black and white keys stared back, waiting. To her left, Richard stood with his arms crossed, a look of amused expectation on his face. He was waiting for her to fumble, to peck out a clumsy version of Happy Birthday or Twinkle Twinkle. Little star. He was waiting for the joke to land, so he and his friends could have another laugh and go back to their beers. But Alina didn't move. She kept her eyes closed for a long moment, letting her hands hover over the keys. She was listening. Not to the room, but to the piano. She could feel the history of the instrument, the stiffness in the action, the dust that settled in the cracks. It was an old, neglected beast, much like she felt sometimes. But she knew how to wake it up. She knew that if you treated it with the right touch, even the most battered piano could sing. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of fried food and beer, and then slowly exhaled, pushing every distracting thought out of her mind. She forgot about the table of 6 waiting for their check. She forgot about the stack of dirty dishes in the sink. She forgot about the rent that was due next week. For the first time in a long time, the noise in her head went quiet. There was only the rhythm in her chest and the anticipation in her fingertips. Slowly, she lowered her hands. Her left hand found a low bass note, pressing it firmly. A deep, resonant sound vibrated through the wood and into the bench. It wasn't a bang like Richard had done. It was a controlled, rich note that seemed to clear the air. A few people at the nearest tables stopped chewing and looked up. The sound was different. It had intention. Then her right hand entered. It wasn't a simple melody. It was a cascade of notes, flowing like water over rocks. Alina opened her eyes, but she didn't look at the audience. She looked only at her hands. Her fingers, which were usually rough and dry from scrubbing tables, suddenly seemed to have a life of their own. They danced across the ivory, swift and precise. The piece she chose was complex, classical arrangement that demanded speed and power. At first, it was a whisper, a gentle introduction that pulled people in. The chatter in the room, which had been about to resume after the awkward pause, died out completely. It was like a spell had been cast. Someone at the bar lowered their glass. The busboy froze in the middle of wiping a table. As the music grew, the transformation in the room was palpable. The dingy atmosphere of the Rusty Spoons seemed to vanish. The flickering fluorescent lights didn't matter anymore. Under the sound of the piano, the restaurant felt like a different place entirely. The music was soaring now, full of emotion and technical skill that was impossible to fake. It was clear immediately that this wasn't a game. This wasn't a drunk patron messing around. This was a musician who knew exactly what she was doing. Elena's posture changed. She wasn't the tired waitress anymore. She sat tall, her body swaying slightly with the music, completely in sync with the instrument. Her wrists moved fluidly, her fingers stretching to hit the far notes with grace. There was a confidence in her playing that she hadn't shown in her service all night. She was in control. This was her domain. Richard's smirk faltered. He uncrossed his arms and took a small step closer to the piano, squinting as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked from Elena's flying hands to her face, which was calm and focused. He had expected a joke, but he was witnessing a masterpiece. He glanced back at his friends, but they weren't laughing. They were staring, open-mouthed. Their drinks forgotten on the table. The music shifted into a faster, more intense passage. Elena's hands were a blur, notes tumbling over one another in a rush of sound that was both chaotic and perfectly ordered. The old piano, which had been out of tune and neglected, was responding to her touch. It sounded rich and full, as if it had been waiting for years for someone to play it this way. The bass notes thundered, shaking the floor slightly, while the high notes sparkled like chimes. People sitting at the tables furthest away stood up to get a better look. They craned their necks, trying to see who was playing. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, but no one spoke loud enough to break the spell. They didn't want to miss a single note. The manager, Dave, stood behind the counter with a towel in his hand, stopped mid-wipe. He had worked with Alina for months and had never known she could play like this. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and pride. Realizing he had completely misjudged the quiet woman who cleared tables, Alina felt a shift in the energy of the room. But she didn't let it distract her. Instead, she used it. She poured her frustration, her loneliness, and her hidden dreams into the keys. Every missed opportunity, every hard shift, every moment of doubt was flowing out of her fingertips and turning into something beautiful. It was a catharsis, a release of everything she had been holding back. She wasn't just playing a song. She was telling a story, and for the first time people were actually listening. The tempo increased. The rhythm became driving and insistent, demanding attention. Elena's left hand kept a steady, pounding beat, while her right hand flew up and down the keyboard. The complexity of the piece was astounding. It was the kind of music that required years of discipline, years of sacrifice. It was the kind of music that belonged in a grand hall, not a corner diner. She could feel the sweat forming on her forehead, but she didn't stop. She was getting closer to the climax of the piece, the part where the music surged to its peak. She hit a series of chords, hard and fast, the sound filling every corner of the restaurant. The plates on the tables seemed to rattle in sympathy. The drunk man in the gray suit took a step back, looking genuinely unnerved. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to mock her, to put her on the spot for a cheap laugh, and instead, she had humiliated him without saying a word. Her talent was so far beyond his understanding that he felt small. The power dynamic in the room had flipped entirely. He was no longer the loud, important customer. He was just a spectator in the shadow of something great. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't care about him anymore. She was lost in the music. She was thinking about the little girl who sat at a piano for hours while other kids played outside. She was thinking about the recitals where she felt invincible. She was remembering that music wasn't just a hobby. It was part of her soul. She had tried to bury it under the weight of daily survival. But you can't bury who you really are. As the piece reached its final crescendo, the music swelled, filling the air with a wall of sound that was breathtakingly beautiful. Elena's hands moved faster than ever, striking the final chords with a force that rang out like a declaration. And then, in a moment of perfect timing, she lifted her hands off the keys. The last note hung in the air, vibrating and fading slowly. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room is holding their breath, not wanting the moment to end. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The echo of the music seemed to bounce off the walls, a ghost of the sound that had just filled their ears. Elena sat there, her chest rising and falling, her hands resting in her lap. The adrenaline was rushing through her veins, making her fingers tingle. She slowly became aware of her surroundings, again the smell of the food, the hardness of the bench, the eyes staring at her. She looked up, blinking as if waking from a deep sleep. The reality of where she was came rushing back. She was just a waitress in a greasy spoon. Or at least, that was who they thought she was. She sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch, letting the audience sit with what they had just heard. She wanted them to feel it. She wanted them to understand that she was more than just the person who brought them their water. She had a voice, and tonight, she had finally used it. The final chord seemed to suspend time in the restaurant. For a heartbeat, there was total stillness. The air felt heavy, charged with the energy of what had just happened. Then the spell broke. It didn't start as a roar. It started as a collective gasp, like a wave rushing through the room. Someone near the bar started clapping, a slow rhythmic sound, and then suddenly, the entire place exploded. It wasn't the polite, sparse clapping you usually hear in a restaurant when a busboy drops a tray. This was thunderous. People were standing up, knocking their chairs back in their haste to rise. Strangers were smiling at each other, sharing a look of total disbelief. The man by the window, the one who had been impatient for his check, was now beaming, his hands stinging from the force of his applause. Even the cooks had pushed through the swinging doors of the kitchen, wiping their hands on their aprons as they leaned out to see where the music was coming from. Elena sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The noise washed over her, but she felt strangely detached from it, floating in the aftermath of the performance. Her fingers were tingling, the adrenaline pumping through her veins so fast that her vision blurred slightly at the edges. She looked up, blinking against the harsh lights of the restaurant, seeing a sea of faces turn toward her. They weren't looking at a waitress anymore. They were looking at an artist. Richard, the man in the gray suit, stood rooted to the spot near the piano. His face had gone pale, the ruddy flush of alcohol completely drained away. He looked smaller now, his shoulders slumped. He watched the applause with a look of utter confusion, his ego shattered by the reality of what he had just witnessed. He looked at his friends, hoping for support, but they were clapping too, looking past him, completely ignoring him. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he wasn't the big man in the room. He was the fool who had challenged a master and lost badly. Alina slowly rose from the bench. As she stood, the applause seemed to grow even louder. She felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She was used to being invisible, to blending into the background. This spotlight felt blinding. She gave a small, awkward nod to the room, a gesture of thanks, and then, instinctively, bent down to pick up her apron from the floor. It felt strange to put it back on. The stained fabric felt heavy and foreign against her skin after the freedom of the music. As she tied the strings around her waist, she felt the shift in her identity acutely. For a few glorious minutes, she had been free. She had been Alina, the pianist. Now, she was Alina, the waitress again. But something had changed. The apron didn't feel like a cage anymore. It just felt like a costume. She knew what was underneath it now. She turned to walk away, but Richard stepped into her path. He looked nervous. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sheepish expression that looked unnatural on his face. He held up his hands, palms open. "I had no idea," he stammered. His voice was much quieter than it had been before. "I mean, wow. That was incredible." Alina looked at him. She didn't feel angry anymore. The anger had dissolved into the music. She just felt a calm sense of pity. "It's okay," she said softly. "You just wanted some entertainment." "That wasn't entertainment," Richard insisted, shaking his head earnestly. "That was talent. Real talent. I'm sorry I made a joke out of it. Please, let me buy you dinner. Or breakfast. Or anything." Alina shook her head, offering him a polite, tired smile. "I'm working, sir." "Thank you, but I have tables to check on." She stepped around him, moving past his group of friends who were now looking at her with a mix of awe and respect. As she walked through the restaurant, the atmosphere was electric. People reached out to pat her on the shoulder as she passed by. "That was beautiful," an older woman whispered, clutching her napkin to her chest. "Do you have a CD?" "I would buy it right now," a younger guy asked, his phone in his hand, though he hadn't recorded it. Alina just kept walking, murmuring quiet thank yous, but keeping her head down. It was overwhelming. She felt like she was walking in a dream. She stopped at table 12, the table where the man had ignored her earlier. He was looking up at her, his phone screen dark. "I apologize," he said, looking her directly in the eyes for the first time all night. "I didn't treat you very well before. I shouldn't have ignored you. You are extraordinary." Lena felt a lump form in her throat. She swallowed it hard. "Thank you," she said. "Can I get you a refill?" "No, I'm fine," he said, placing a $50 bill on the table, far more than the check required. "Please, take this. You deserve it." She moved from table to table, and the reception was the same. The dynamic had flipped completely. The customers, who had been treating her like furniture just an hour ago, were now treating her like a celebrity. It wasn't just because she had played well. It was because she had surprised them. She had broken the script. They had a box in their heads labeled Waitress, and she had climbed out of it and showed them something they didn't expect. Even the energy from the kitchen was different. As she dropped off some dirty dishes, the chef, a big guy who rarely spoke, looked at her with wide eyes. "Alina," he said, "why didn't you tell us?" "You've been holding out on us," she shrugged, wiping her hands on a towel. "I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," he said simply. "It matters a lot." The shift eventually wound down, though the buzz lingered in the air long after the customers left. The group of men in suits eventually paid their bill and left. Richard didn't say much more, just gave her a stiff, respectful nod on his way out. He left the $20 he had bet on the piano tucked under the vase on the table. He hadn't won it, and he knew it. It felt like a peace offering when the last customer finally walked out the door. Alina let out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. The restaurant was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely, empty silence of before. It was a peaceful, satisfied silence. The music seemed to have left a residue in the air, a feeling of warmth that chased away the chill of the night, she began her closing duties. Wiping down the counters and sweeping the floor. Usually this was the worst part of the night, the time when her body screamed for sleep and her mind raced with anxiety about the next day. But tonight her body was tired, but her mind was wide awake. She felt energized. She felt alive. She found herself back at the piano. She sat down on the bench, looking at the keys. It felt different now, too. It wasn't a dusty stranger anymore. It was a friend. She ran her fingers over the keys gently, not playing a song, just feeling the cool plastic. She thought about the fear she had felt earlier, the fear that she had lost it, that her talent had dried up from neglect. But sitting there now, she knew it wasn't true. The music was still there. It had just been waiting for her to be ready to let it out. Dave, the manager, came out of the office holding the deposit bag. He saw her sitting at the piano and stopped. He didn't rush her or tell her to get back to work. He just leaned against the doorframe and watched her. Dave said, breaking the silence. "We should do this more often. Maybe have a music night." "You could play." Lena looked up at him, a surprised look on her face. "You think so?" "I know so," Dave said firmly. "People come here for the burgers, Alina. But tonight, they came for the magic. You gave them something they can't get anywhere else." Alina smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I'd like that," she said. "I really would." She stood up and grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. She clocked out, the sound of the time card punch echoing in the empty room. As she walked out into the cool night air, the city lights flickering above her, she didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders like she usually did. She walked with a little bit of a spring in her step. Her hands were rough from work, her feet were sore, and her apron was still stained with grease. But underneath it all, she felt strong. She had a secret weapon, a source of power that was all her own. She unlocked her bike and clipped her helmet on. As she rode home through the quiet streets, the wind in her face, she hummed a tune. It was the melody from the piece she had played earlier. She was already thinking about the next time, about what she would play, about how she would practice. The music was back in her life, and this time she wasn't going to let it go. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the blinds of Elena's small apartment, casting long stripes of light across the floor. Usually, by this time of the morning, the silence of the room would feel heavy, a reminder of another day of routine ahead. But today the silence felt different. It felt full of possibility. Alina woke up and stretched, feeling a soreness in her shoulders that wasn't from lifting trays, but from the tension of playing the piano with such intensity. It was a good kind of ache, a reminder that she had truly used her body for something it was meant to do. She got out of bed and walked over to the corner, where her electric keyboard sat. For months, it had been nothing more than a shelf for laundry and unread mail. She carefully moved a stack of bills to the floor and sat down on the bench. It felt familiar, yet strange. She plugged it in, turned the volume down low so she wouldn't wake the neighbors, and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't try to play a complicated concerto. She just played a simple scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. The notes rang out clean and clear, perfectly in tune, unlike the old piano at the restaurant. She closed her eyes and let her fingers wander, playing a soft, gentle melody that had been stuck in her head since the night before. As she played, she realized she didn't feel the fear that usually paralyzed her when she thought about music. She didn't worry about being perfect or about the rent. She just enjoyed the sound. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking her concentration. Alina sighed, assuming it was a spam call or a text from the electric company. She walked over and picked it up. It was a text from Dave, the manager. "Check the restaurant's social media page. You broke the internet last night." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened the app. At the top of the page was a video posted by one of the customers from the night before. The caption read, "Waitress at the Rusty Spoon asterisk. Destroys a drunk heckler with the most beautiful piano performance I've ever heard. You have to see this." Asterisk. Her hand trembled as she pressed play. The camera was shaky, filmed sideways from a phone on a table. The audio wasn't perfect. You could hear the clinking of glasses and a low murmur of voices, but when she started playing, the sound was powerful. The video zoomed in on her face, capturing the moment she closed her eyes and the music took over. Watching it from the outside, she saw not a tired waitress, but a woman transformed. She scrolled down to the comments. There were hundreds of them. Who is this? She has a record deal yet? I was there last night. It gave me goosebumps. That man in the suit looks like he learned a lesson. Talent like this shouldn't be hidden. More, please. The view counter kept climbing, ticking higher every time she refreshed the screen. It had already been shared thousands of times. Elena put the phone down, her mind racing. She had played for a room of 30 people, but now she was playing for the world. The thought was terrifying, but it was also thrilling. She had spent so long hiding her talent, thinking it wasn't enough, thinking she wasn't enough. Now, strangers were telling her she was wrong. She got ready for work, but she did it differently today. She took a little extra time with her hair. She put on her favorite uniform, the one that didn't have any loose threads. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see just a server. She saw a musician who happened to be serving tables to pay the bills. It was a small shift in perspective, but it made all the difference. When she arrived at the Rusty Spoon for her shift, the atmosphere had completely changed. Usually the place was dead on a Wednesday afternoon, with just a few regulars drinking coffee at the counter. Today, there was a line out the door. As she walked in, the few customers already seated looked up. A young couple in the corner waved at her. "You're her, the piano girl." The girl said, her eyes bright. "We drove 40 minutes to eat here because we saw the video." "Are you going to play tonight?" Elena smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I think I might squeeze in a song," she said. Dave came out of the kitchen, looking busier than usual but grinning from ear to ear. "There she is," he said. "Elena, can you believe this? We haven't had this much press since we opened 10 years ago. The local news station just called. They want to interview you." Elena's eyes went wide. "The news? Me?" "Yes, you," Dave laughed. "You're the star of the show, kid. Table 4 is asking if you serve autographs with the fries." He handed her an apron, but before she tied it on, she walked over to the piano in the corner. It was still sitting there in the shadows. A vase of fresh flowers had been placed on top of it, a gift from an anonymous admirer. She ran her hand along the wood. "Hello, old friend," she whispered. She sat down and played a quick, lively jazz tune just to warm up the room. Immediately, heads turned. Conversations stopped. The lunch rush stopped eating. It wasn't the emotional classical piece from the night before. It was light and happy, full of energy. It was the sound of someone who was enjoying their job. The shift flew by in a blur. Instead of the usual dragging hours, the restaurant was buzzing with excitement. People were taking photos of their food, but mostly they were looking at the piano. Every time she passed by, someone would ask for a song. She didn't play every request, but she promised them a performance at 8 p.m. Around 7:30. The restaurant was packed again. It wasn't just the regulars. There were people in suits, college students, families. It was a mix of everyone brought together by a shared curiosity. Elena felt the nerves creeping back in her stomach as the time ticked closer. This was different from the spontaneous act of the night before. Now, there was expectation. She looked over at the bar. There was an empty stool where the loud man in the gray suit had sat. He wasn't there. Part of her had wondered if he would come back to heckle her again, but he was gone. She realized she didn't need him to push her anymore. She had her own motivation now. 8 p.m. arrived. Dave dimmed the lights slightly, a signal he had improvised. Elena finished clearing a table, wiped her hands on a cloth, and walked toward the piano. The room fell silent without anyone having to ask. It was a respectful silence, a waiting silence. She sat down and adjusted the microphone that Dave had rigged up for her. She looked out at the sea of faces. There were phones held up, ready to record. There were smiling eyes. There were people who looked like they had had a long week and just needed to hear something beautiful. "This is called River Flows in You," Elena said into the mic, her voice shaking only slightly. "I hope you like it." She began to play. The melody was sweet and flowing, gentle like a stream. It wasn't as technically difficult as the classical piece she had played the night before, but it was full of heart. She closed her eyes and let the feeling of the music take over. She thought about how scared she had been just yesterday, how she had let her dreams die because she was afraid of failing. She realized that the fear hadn't gone away, but she had found the courage to play through it as she played. She saw the effect it had on people. A tired woman in the corner closed her eyes, a peaceful look settling on her face. A father held his daughter's hand, swaying gently to the rhythm. The phones stayed up, capturing the moment, but the people present were really there, listening. When she finished, the applause was even louder than before. It was a roar of appreciation, not just for the trick, but for the art. Elena stood up and bowed. She felt light. She felt like she was floating. After the show, people lined up to thank her. She accepted tips that were folded into her hand, along with words of encouragement. One woman gave her a business card. "My son runs a music school downtown," she said. "If you ever want to teach or need a place to practice, give us a call." Elena took the card, holding it like it was made of gold. She looked at the piano one last time before clocking out. It was dusty and scratched, sitting in the corner of a diner. But to her, it was a launch pad. Walking out into the night air, Elena didn't feel the bone-deep exhaustion that usually haunted her. She felt a hum of excitement in her veins. She still had to pay her rent. She still had shifts to work. But she knew now that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The world had heard her play, and she was finally ready to listen to herself. She hailed a cab, something she never did because she was usually too frugal, and got in. She had had a long day, and for the first time in a long time, she was excited to wake up and do it all again tomorrow.